Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 6th of June and this is The Full Scottish. I'm Andrew Wilson and today I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh. First, we will look at today's coronavirus update and then we will look at the news headlines with some excellent guests. At weekends, only statistics on new cases, deaths and vaccinations are updated. And so, as at 2 p.m. yesterday, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 239,753 people have tested positive for COVID-19 through NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres. That means that there are 860 new cases in Scotland. There is one new reported death of a person who has tested positive, and this means that the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 7,607 who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. In terms of the vaccinations programme, 3,345,842 people have received their first dose of the vaccination and 2,202,547 have received their second dose. And just to reiterate, there has been one new reported death of a person who has tested positive. This means that the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by coronavirus now stands at 7,677. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Now, I'm delighted to say that we are joined by experienced and enlightened Scottish politicians who will share their thoughts and reflections on the main news of the past 7 days from a Scottish perspective. Firstly, we're joined by Emma Harper MSP. Emma grew up on dairy farms in Dumfries and Galloway. She then followed her calling into the nursing profession and is a degree-registered nurse, a member of the Royal College of Nursing and the Association for Perioperative Practice. Emma was elected to represent the south of Scotland in 2016 and was Deputy Convener on the Health and Sport Committee and a member of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee. She was re-elected to the Scottish Parliament at the election in May this year. Good afternoon, Emma. How are you today?
I am very well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you for asking me to be here today.
It's a pleasure for us that you're able to join us. Thank you. I think we may be joined by a second guest. He's having some problems connecting. So we'll allow Paul Wheelhouse, who we hope will be able to join us shortly. We'll let Paul continue to fight with the technology. And in the meantime, we'll press on with the conversation with Emma. And I certainly hope that Paul is able to join us. A lot of what we're going to be discussing today is inevitably through the prism of the pandemic. So we should get straight to the point. Scotland is at the start of a third wave of coronavirus as the number of cases and hospitalisations continues to rise, Nicola Sturgeon has said. The First Minister said that although the government, off the back of the success of the vaccine programme, will be able to move away from more restrictive ways of dealing with the pandemic, the position just now is still fragile. Speaking during last Thursday's COVID briefing, the First Minister said that the vaccine programme is progressing extremely well, but that Scotland is at a critical juncture in the pandemic. She went on to say the R number is now estimated to be above 1. Indeed, many experts believe that not just Scotland, but the UK is at the start of a third wave of COVID. Driving all of this is the new Delta variant that makes up the majority of new cases in Scotland. So, Emma, first of all, what is the reaction to this news that you are hearing from voters?
Locally, and well, yesterday actually, I was one of the vaccinators at one of our vaccination clinics in Dumfries, and it was the 30 to 39-year-old cohort that we were injecting, and many of them were happy to be coming in and contributing to being able to support the reduction in the numbers of COVID cases. There were some sceptical folk that we encountered yesterday as well, but out there in our local area more generally, there are people that are happy that the vaccination programme is progressing and that we're progressing pretty well. People are a bit optimistic now, knowing that even though there is what looks like an increase in number of COVID cases, especially this Delta variant, but people are a bit more encouraged that more and more folk are getting their vaccine, and they're going to continue to encourage other people to take the vaccine as well.
That's interesting, Emma. The news that you're hearing, that people are currently perhaps in a more positive frame of mind because they can see the vaccination program working, and perhaps the vaccination program is having an effect on both number of hospitalizations and the mortality rate as well. Did you get the impression that people are balancing these competing challenges out in their minds? Can people see the whole picture? Is what I'm saying.
I think it is difficult sometimes for us in a really rural constituency to see what the perception is of the bigger picture. Personally, in my background as a nurse, I am really worried that if we continue to see the numbers increase, then we'll have measures that will prevent a recovery, as in cancer screening and other surgeries that have been postponed or delayed due to the pandemic. Our NHS staff have been under immense pressure in the last, 15, 16 months. And I see that firsthand because of my sister's work on the front line. So I think we need to make sure that everybody is as informed as possible, and that they are engaged in a way that we move forward in a cautious approach. I would hate to see all the good work of the last few months be undone, because we need to make sure that everybody does continue to follow guidance and protect themselves and protect the most vulnerable people out there.
Thanks, Emma. That's sage advice. And thinking for a moment, because you mentioned it, thinking for a moment about the practitioners. In fact, everyone working in Scotland's NHS. What do you think needs to be done to support them after a year like no other they've experienced before?
We need to certainly look after our NHS workforce and our social care workforce as well. We had a debate last week about healthcare recovery and mental health, and the mental health and well-being of everyone, practitioners and the social care workforce is a huge concern, and it's something that myself, as co-convener of the mental health cross-party group, will be continue to look at what work is being done that's really good, and then how can we reflect that nationally, because there is some great progress out there, and I want to make sure we can replicate good practice and disseminate it across the whole of Scotland.
We need to be learning lessons. Now I can see joining us as well is Paul Wheelhouse. Paul, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, thankfully, after the sound problem earlier.
Not a problem. Thank you for joining us on the Full Scottish today. Paul grew up in Edinburgh, and before entering politics, he worked as an economist specialising in higher education, government policy and impact assessments for private capital projects. He was first elected to our Parliament in 2011 to represent the south of Scotland. He held ministerial posts for 9 years, covering variously energy connectivity in the islands, business innovation and energy, community safety and legal affairs, and environment and climate change. At the 2021 Scottish election, Paul increased his vote, but was unable to win the constituency of Ettrick, Roxburgh and Berwickshire, and was not returned this time on the list either. Paul, good afternoon. How are you doing today?
Very well, thank you. I didn't get any sunburn yesterday, which is a victory. Emma, all the best for her role in the Scottish Parliament, and glad that she's back. So very glad she's back.
That's great. Thank you, Paul. We're delighted that you're able to join us today. Now, we were starting today's programme talking about the concern that's been raised with regard to the possible sign of a third wave of infections, of COVID infections in Scotland. We have a graphic here that shows the 14-day moving average of infection rates in Scotland. We use the 14-day rolling average because that means we smooth out the impact that weekends would have on the data, and so we get a smoother graph and probably a more representative graph. Also, because the time it takes for coronavirus infection to incubate, which we think is around 14 days. And so, looking at this graph and looking in particular at the rate of increase that we're seeing into May and June this year, Paul, coming back to think about the wider community, do you think that we should be refining or adjusting our approach to the pandemic if, as it looks, we're starting to see a third wave of infections?
Well, I think if we've learned anything, that this virus is able to change its attack, if you like, its line of attack, both in terms of the ability of it to, with later variants such as the Delta variant, much more transmissible. So we do probably have to always be alert to the need to perhaps change our tactics and modify our approach. I mean, obviously, I think Emma was picking up the point around vaccinations. It's hugely important. I mean, I've got my letter here for my second vaccination on Tuesday, and we obviously know that the Delta variant is effectively, or seems to be effectively, dealt with by those who've had double vaccination. So we have to kind of press on with that program. That's one thing that doesn't change. I think no matter what else we do, we have to try and get as many people as possible vaccinated. But that chart is I suppose, slightly concerning. But we always knew there would be, as you reopen the economy, as it happened before, there would be a pickup in infections and transmission as we emerge from lockdown. So I think it's not to be unexpected that there has been a pickup in infection rates. And I think the thing that the First Minister is very much emphasising is that a number of experts are concerned about the potential for a third wave. And so we've got to take that seriously and act as if we're already in one as individuals, and maintain that hand hygiene, use of face coverings, and physical distancing as much as we can, while allowing us to have some additional activities that are very welcome in terms of hospital visiting for relatives, that kind of thing. These are, if they're well managed, hopefully safe, and give us a little bit more freedom, but we've got to all take a bit of responsibility. And so the data in the last few days have probably shaken us out of any kind of complacency that we had, I think, as a country, not as a government, but as a country.
That's a very good point, Paul. And thinking a little bit about the Delta variant that we're being told now perhaps maybe more easily transmitted between people and the challenges that it brings, and a reflection that this variant appears to have been introduced to the British Isles at a time when there were very limited controls on international travel. Do you think that the potential for a third wave, and think closing borders was a hot political topic about 10 months ago as we came into the summer. Paul, do you think that closing borders or taking more clearer and more effective action to control the spread of the virus, do you think that's something that we need to come back to and look again at?
Well, I think so, yeah. Certainly from the UK government, I think they need to rethink their approach. The Scottish government, took a bit of stick at the time when the policy was set out. I remember when I was working with Michael Matheson at the time, we took a bit of stick for the policy we took on managed isolation for those coming back from any international destination. And I think that while that's inconvenient and it's costly for the individuals concerned, it is absolutely vital to maintain that lack of permeability, if you like, for the virus to get into the country. And unfortunately, the UK government seems to be kind of jumping all over the place with its red list. So countries are on the green list one minute, on the red list the next. I think the approach that Michael took was a sensible one. Also had some simplicity from the point of view of airport operators as well, not having to strip people out from those flights that come in from red list countries or amber list, from green list, and from domestic travellers, because we don't have separate international terminals in our Scottish airports. So I think there are a number of complexities to it, but I would certainly advocate, I think the UK government needs to think very, very carefully. I think the pausing of putting India into a more challenged position appeared to be because of Boris Johnson's visit. Now, I suppose the fullness of time, the full detail of that and the rationale for that and the decision-making points will become public knowledge. And I hope for their sake they weren't playing risks with people's health in this country in order to have a successful trade visit to India. That would be shocking and unforgivable. But we are where we are now. We've all got to work together to try and make sure we don't allow this Delta variant to spread across the country. And it does seem to be the majority of cases now, and it does seem to be, seeing some estimates, up to 40% transmission.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. Now we'll move from health to education. The Education Secretary, Shirley Ann Somerville, has outlined wide-ranging plans for education recovery in the first 100 days of the new government and beyond. She also said the role, remit and purpose of key national agencies, Education Scotland and the Scottish Qualifications Authority, will be considered, as well as their functions and government's arrangements. The plans announced include investing over £1 billion to close the poverty-related attainment gap, recruiting 3,500 additional teachers and teaching assistants, ensuring every child has access to technology they need to support their education, expanding free early learning and childcare and developing the provision of wraparound care and after-school clubs, providing interim support including a £100 payment near the start of the summer holidays for eligible children, and offering a £20 million summer programme to help restore the well-being of children and young people, particularly those worst hit by COVID-19. Laying out these plans for education, the Education Secretary said that the priority was to continue to deliver excellence and equity with the health and well-being of pupils at the forefront of the plans. She went on to say, "I want to signal my intention to start this process by considering how to reform the SQA and Education Scotland. This will be a key priority for me," she said. Ms Somerville said the reform plans would be informed by the findings of the OECD review into the Curriculum for Excellence, which is due to be published on the 21st of June. So Emma, coming to you first, as we approach the end of the summer term and then begin the summer holidays, where do you think that the pressure points are going to be for your constituents, and what does the Scottish Government need to do to help those constituents?
So for many of the young people in my area, I know that there were real challenges with even access to the computer technology that they would need in order to engage in the best way for their education. I welcome that the new Cabinet Secretary for Education in her first debate said that she wanted to reform and use the same words that you used, Andrew, the role, the remit and the purpose of the SQA and the Education Scotland needs to be looked at. And the 21st of June report that will come out just before the summer recess, it will be great to see what comes out of that. And over the summer, I know that the senior charge nurse that I spoke to yesterday said that she had concerns about how do we support young people during the summer holidays and the recess, and she alluded to the need for increased support for their well-being as well. So that's work that will be communicated to make sure that does happen.
That's an interesting point that you make, Emma, in terms of connecting together two of the things we were just touching on in terms of supporting everyone who's working in Scotland's NHS over the summer months when their children would normally not be at school. The provision for those young people, I can see that support, in a sense, that supports the SNHS workforce too. Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, like just yesterday, there were 9 vaccinators at the clinic, and many of them had their young families at home because it was the weekend. But we did have conversation around what would be the best way to support the families and the NHS workforce. A lot of the NHS staff have worked throughout the pandemic, and their young ones have been supported by teachers as well in the schools. So it's this whole COVID pandemic has just thrown issues up in the air, and many challenges have been addressed and taken forward and delivered. But it's interesting, like in the debate the other day, the opposition were complaining about attainment, complaining about things not changing, as if there hadn't even been a pandemic. So we do need to remember that these are really, really challenging times, and the last 15 months have been unprecedented. And I know we use that word a lot, but we need to remember that This pandemic has meant that massive changes have had to be made and implemented in the best way possible because we have not had this experience to deal with in the past.
Thanks, Emma. Paul, turning to you now, thinking about the priority that we've been told that the Scottish Government has been giving and will continue to give to education, where do you think that the Scottish Government needs to really focus in education as a system, in our education system as a whole?
Well, I think as Emma says, it's been an unprecedented period, and I normally hate that word being used, but I think it is true here that there's been such a dramatic impact on the pupils and the teachers and staff of the schools. So there's probably, it's a difficult thing to adjust to, but I think we have to recognise that there's probably increased need for tackling morale within the teaching workforce. I have many friends, I'm sure Emma does as well, who through local branches and local politics who are teachers, and they are obviously naturally supportive in those cases of the government. But they are also reporting that they're very exhausted and somewhat demoralised, and that's probably to be expected both in the health service and other key sectors such as education, where people have been under enormous pressure for a long period of time with little scope for breaks. So I think that's a hard thing to tackle. I do think if there is any reform of SQA in Education Scotland, one thing that would be useful to look at is what more we can do to capture the expertise of teachers themselves, because that's one thing that's been said to me in recent months, that whatever other strengths the current model has, one of the weaknesses is there's a lack of a forum for teachers to feed back in around curriculum change, teaching methods. Perhaps that's something that's difficult to manage with such a large workforce, but I don't know whether there's a means of doing that and providing some encouragement for good teachers to feed in their experience and spread good practice around the country, especially as we tackle some of the issues Emma highlighted about those pupils that have been badly affected by this crisis, and to help them recover lost ground. And I'm particularly worried about early years, where a number of primary teachers I know have said that those who are coming in the P1 intake this year and the P1 intake from last year are really way behind, or were way behind where they expected them to be at the start of the academic year. And that's obviously going to have a knock-on consequence if that isn't tackled as they move through into year 3, year 4, etc. So this crisis will have a legacy, and hopefully it can be a short-term legacy, but we need to work really hard to make sure it isn't a long-term one for those pupils and staff who've been affected.
Thanks, Paul. That's a very good point that you make. I have a number of educators in my life as well, and I know that conversations have started in the last. I've been party to conversations in the past 2 weeks talking about early years, and a number of early years educators saying they think they can see that the youngest people joining our education system, perhaps their language skills have not yet developed, and they're facing other challenges which are clearly as a result of the pandemic, and so that we need to innovate and to address those, listen to educators and address those concerns quickly, I think is absolutely right. So you make a very good point. Thank you. One other thing, Paul, we have a new government and we have a new education secretary. Do you think a new education secretary will be able to make a difference?
Well, I hope so. I mean, it's obviously a very tough shift that John Swinney had, and I think it must have been equally exhausting for ministers looking after the affairs of education, because they'll be obviously very concerned about the impact on pupils. I know John takes his responsibilities extremely seriously. As any ministerial changes, including ones I've had where I've moved on and someone else is coming after me, it's a good opportunity actually to refresh things. You get introductory meetings, you get perhaps to hear things as they are, rather than perhaps relying on information you've had from months ago. But I do think the key thing is really to get the resources in the right place, to get that engagement between the teaching profession and the government. And to some extent that doesn't need to have had a ministerial change, but I think the fact that Shirley Ann's come in, I'm sure she'll have an enthusiasm for the post, and that will be something that will carry through as a parent herself. As John was, I know she will take it equally seriously, and will want to do a good job here, because there's perhaps no more important job in many ways than educating the next generation of children. So I wish her every success, and she's a very good minister, a very good, competent minister, and I'm sure she will be very diligent in how she goes about her job. And if we can get the kind of engagement between the teaching unions, teaching profession, and ministers, and working together, I'm sure things can turn around.
Now, thanks, Paul. We're going to move now to talk about the economy more generally, Scotland's economy in particular. But the point that you just made is very relevant to this discussion. Supporting businesses to recover from the coronavirus pandemic should be a national endeavour, according to the Economy Secretary, Kate Forbes. A new 10-year national strategy for economic transformation will set out how business and government will work together to create the best conditions for entrepreneurs to flourish. A national challenge competition backed by £50 million of funding will support projects with the greatest economic potential. The Economy Secretary said, "We must unashamedly use the experience, expertise and ingenuity of businesses, trades unions and workforces to deliver greater, greener and fairer prosperity. We want to work in partnership with the entrepreneurs and thinkers, the job creators and the hard workers." So, Paul, thinking about the statement from Economy Secretary Kate Forbes, do you think that 10-year plans work for national economies?
Overnight recovery. So I think that's one thing we have to take on the chin, that we'll see an immediate pickup in the economy to some degree in those areas such as, areas like white goods or furniture, carpets, these kind of things. People have been putting off buying them for some time. They'll probably get an immediate response. But for service sector, employers, the majority of our economy, you don't buy a service twice. So if you haven't used that service, you're not going to go out and say, "I'm going to have 2 haircuts this month, please." So people have lost out. And so there's going to be a real need to rebuild the economy. I would really like the ambition of the government in this respect, and sort of looking at areas, the innovation around, say, the national competition for £50 million prize for anyone who can demonstrate the single kind of investment opportunity that can make the biggest difference to economic growth. I think that's an innovative way of thinking. And so I did like the chutzpah of one of my fellow activists who suggested independence would be the winner there, and they should get the £50 million immediately. Nice try, but I think Kate's looking for an economic project. But I do think these are really exciting opportunities. Whether it's something, it could be something like hydrogen, it could be in other areas of the economy. I think we've got many opportunities in Scotland, and we've got a naturally better opportunity to exploit them than some other countries. So I think thinking big, thinking long term is generally a good thing for planning around the economy. Obviously, no minister can control everything down to a micro level in the economy. All you can do is put in place the favourable conditions that allow businesses to thrive and to allow workers to have secure employment. I'd do love it if we had employment law devolved to Scotland, for example. I think that would be enormously helpful to ministers in their efforts to stimulate the economy. But we've got the tools we've got. I think Kate's using them in a very sensible way. The Rural Enterprise Fund, for example, for a region like the south of Scotland could be really important in trying to stimulate 2,000 more rural enterprises and giving them up to £10,000 each to get them started. These kind of things don't sound huge, but they could have a very significant impact if even a small proportion of those 2,000 companies go on to be big employers and get the support through the enterprise networks after they've started. It could be transformational. And I know with agencies like South of Scotland Enterprise on the scene now in our region, that's the kind of ability to look a much more focused way on what our region needs. These are all coming together in a way that I think will help stimulate that recovery and have key milestones to achieve over that 10-year period. There's the old saying, isn't it? What gets measured gets done. And I think if you've got targets for growth and you measure your performance against them, it's much more likely to happen than just letting it happen by accident.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. Emma, thinking for a moment about the economic priorities that voters are raising with you, in particular in southwest Scotland, what are you hearing on the doorsteps with regard to voters' economic priorities?
Well, we haven't been out on the doorsteps very much because of the pandemic, but when we're able to engage, like one area we have is what Paul has just mentioned, that growth opportunity. Some of this medium-sized businesses in in the south of Scotland maybe employ 30 people or 50 people, and that's equivalent to 300 folk in the Central Belt. So we need to certainly look at, not just measuring the businesses in the south as equivalent to the enterprises in the larger populated areas. So our wee businesses, if we want them to grow, we need to make sure that they are supported and engaged with. And we've seen with the South Scotland enterprise hitting the ground running on April the 1st that there has been support given. And today, across the road from my house, there's a local farmers market which supports 50 full-time employees, but they're all individual businesses that are now working together so that they can grow and develop. I love the idea of, or the creation of, a women's business enterprise, and that again can focus on maybe bespoke issues that matter to women in order to develop business. So there's lots to be looking forward to, which was committed to in the manifesto, and I look forward to be part of the support network to take all of that forward.
Thank you, Emma. That's fantastic. That's really helpful. Now then, we'll move on from the Scottish economy to think a little bit more about the global economy. Finance ministers from the world's richest countries have agreed to back a corporate tax rate of at least 15% to stop tax havens competing to attract tech giants like Amazon and Facebook. Finance ministers from the G7 nations on Saturday pledged to commit to a minimum global level of corporate tax of at least 15%. The move aims to get multinationals, particularly tech giants, to pay more into government coffers hit hard by the pandemic. The global minimum tax would be levied only on the world's 100 largest and most profitable companies. If a company pays taxes somewhere with a lower rate, it would probably have to pay top-up taxes. Such a move aims to end what the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has called a 30-year race to the bottom on corporate tax rates as countries compete to lure multinationals. So, Paul, firstly, do we need governments to be banding together to manage the world's largest and most profitable 100 companies?
I think the answer is probably yes. We do have some very successful companies, obviously, that have grown enormously large, even growing further during the pandemic, of course, because of the switch to online retail. And I've done a lot more buying online than I normally have done during the pandemic myself. So I'm beginning to see that some of these companies are very effective. They do a good job, but typically they pay no or very little tax. And I do welcome the fact that the G7 have come to some sort of agreement. I know President Biden sought to set the floor at 21% and it ended up being 15%. Put that in context, Ireland's corporation tax rate is 12.5%. So clearly there's going to be an issue with some countries signing up to this deal, which implies them actually raising taxes or, as you say, putting supplementary taxes on to reach that 15% floor. So I think one of the most significant things, though, that I picked up from this that you haven't mentioned, but I think is very important, is that the tax revenues would be liable to the country where the sales take place. We've obviously had a situation in Scotland within the UK context, many companies reporting their corporation tax in London, and that not being counted towards our national account. So it's quite an interesting development that on this measure, at a national level, albeit we're stuck within the UK at the moment, the corporation tax receipts from companies like Amazon and Google, these kind of large firms, would be reported in the country in which the sales are generated. So they would be reporting a number of different jurisdictions, not just in the one where their corporate headquarters is. So I think that's very important, and it stops people fiddling the system, or playing the system, if you like, playing one country's corporation tax rate off against another. But we still got to see what the OECD thinks of this, which is a much bigger group of countries, and when they come together, whether they will sign up to this standard, because that's hugely significant, and that's not yet been reached. So it's only at the moment the G7. We need to see that all countries, effectively all mature countries, will sign up to this.
That's a very good point that you make, Paul. And thinking about G7, obviously that excludes a number of economic powerhouses or quickly growing economies around the world. Do you think that the G7 should focus on spreading this word and seeking to persuade other countries which are not yet part of this agreement, persuading other countries of the benefits of agreeing and participating in this 15% floor?
Yeah, I think so, because I think probably one of the things that might have been a deterrent to countries signing up would have been this issue that they would maybe want to report in where the corporate headquarters is. But if Google's making a lot of sales in a state, say in West Africa somewhere, or South Africa, that means the taxes would go to that country, not to their US headquarters. So I think that's really important. I think from the point of view of winning people over, that everyone can benefit from it. So there's a merit in signing up, and it's a bit of a situation all for one and one for all. If we can get that collaboration, which has happened internationally in the past in a number of other occasions and other matters, then it can stop this insidious problem where we're losing tax receipts from our high streets, and where they're struggling and they can no longer generate profit, and seeing that going online, and it's having a detrimental impact on the ability of all governments to fund public services and to respond to the COVID pandemic. So there's a moral responsibility here as well. I hope it's one that at the level it's been set, well, it's less than I would have liked to see. I hope at least it brings in a floor, and it's something that the big companies can sign up to. And that it'd be good for their reputations ultimately, because I think a lot of people who don't buy from them because they think they're dodging their responsibilities. And if they are paying taxes in countries like the UK and hopefully future and independent Scotland, their customers will be happier using them if they feel that's not stealing money away from the NHS or our local schools and so forth. So I think that's quite an important message to other nations as well.
Absolutely, Paul, and the idea that corporate social responsibility, which has become something that's important for the largest corporates, now the rubber really starts to hit the road, because we're talking here in real financial terms about corporate social responsibility. As you say, it has the possibility of being a game changer for some corporations. Emma, much of the Brexit project seemed to be about establishing the UK as a Singapore on sea, which means lower corporate taxes and even lower workers' rights. Do you think that this UK government is serious about this plan, or is it just window dressing by the Chancellor?
I hope they're not serious about this plan. Paul's talked about how we can support developing countries and countries that are more developed. They're benefiting from stronger economies, for instance. But I would like to see us be not necessarily have a Singapore style of no corporate tax or an economy based in that model. I'd like to see our country. Well, obviously, I would like to see better fiscal freedoms for the Scottish Government to pursue the best programmes that can support our families that are suffering from health inequality as well. I would like to see the greater global good come out of the G7 summit, and I know that President Biden did want 21% as the corporate tax, and now it's going to be agreed at 15. But I just read a statistic that Amazon pay more to Fife Council in rent and rates, which is about £2 million, compared to the £1.7 million that they pay in corporate tax. So I suppose, like, looking at Brexit and the way forward, and the way forward for Scotland, we are diverging from the UK government's models, and Scotland seems to be wanting to be a more fairer, egalitarian, promoting equality as a society, and that's what I certainly ascribe to and would like to see that pursued in whatever way we can do. And independence is the way that I want to see us move forward.
Thanks, Emma. We'll look at another aspect of Scotland's economy now, because the South of Scotland Enterprise has appointed Dr. Martin Valenti as its first ever Energy Transition and Green Enterprise Director. The newly created role will see Dr. Valenti join the South of Scotland Enterprise team on the 5th of July, and he will lead the economic and community development agency's efforts to help the region to transition to a net zero economy. This includes taking forward the work of the South of Scotland Energy Transition Group's Powering Change call to action. Dr. Valenti worked for SEPA for 17 years, where he held a number of senior positions. His most recent role was a secondment at Scottish Enterprise as head of climate enterprise and the strategic lead for COP26. So, Paul, what does this appointment tell us about the ambition of South of Scotland Enterprise and also its priorities?
I think it's the ambition word is a very important one. When I was first elected in 2011, and I say this with no criticism for the individuals that I'm perhaps in danger of traducing here, but when I first started to engage with Scottish Enterprise, I was disappointed at the lack of a bespoke kind of vision and ambition for the South of Scotland. Now, the South of Scotland is fortunate in many ways with strength in natural resources. We have very strong production of renewable energy from the region. Obviously, historically, there's been likes of nuclear power stations at Chapel Cross, which are being decommissioned. But it's now a real powerhouse of renewable energy, hydroelectricity, wind power, and potentially in the future offshore wind. And we've got jobs in Eyemouth that are being generated in the near future from one of the Forth and Tay offshore wind projects in North Nagria. So it's beginning to become a very important sector for the economy as we move into context of COP26 and decarbonise the economy. But because we've got that wealth of renewable energy, perhaps the South of Scotland's best placed to capitalise in those sectors that need to use renewable energy and also technologies that are reliant on renewable energy as well, such as electric vehicles, air source heat pumps for decarbonising our heating systems in our homes. So we've got to make that essential energy transition, and it's going to be difficult. But the South of Scotland and Scotland more generally is very well placed to do that. And I think an appointment like this for someone of the calibre of Martin has been absolutely a brilliant move by South of Scotland Enterprise, and it shows they're serious and ambitious about developing that decarbonised economy and capitalising on the area's wealth of energy resources. And the second thing I think it probably sends as a signal is that the South of Scotland is no longer content to be a bystander economically. This is the growth area of the Scottish economy, and the South is actually competing for those jobs. Whereas in the past, perhaps it was in danger of just getting the crumbs off the table. And I know there's been accusations about the South of Scotland being a forgotten region. I don't personally believe that. I think it's a region that is not overlooked by government and its agencies, but it's now got an agency that can really be its champion and look for tailored solutions for the economic opportunities and the challenges that it faces. So I'm really excited by this appointment because I think it does show that the Chief Executive and Chair are really serious about pursuing growth in a sustainable way in the region.
It's an interesting point that you make, Paul. I'm old enough to remember the days when Highlands and Islands Enterprise made large strategic investments in all sorts of things, some of which are, well, many of which are still there, not all of which are necessarily still in productive use. But do you think that this appointment is an indication, perhaps, that, as you say, the South of Scotland and South of Scotland Enterprise in particular are beginning to embrace that kind of ambition for really structural and really significant investments and developments in order to support the economy that's specific to the South of Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, it touches very much on the earlier point we were talking about Kate Forbes' 10-year plan. These things don't happen by accident in terms of economic transformation. I've been in and out in my previous career working with Highlands Isles Enterprise, been hugely impressed by the ambition they had for their region. And myself, Emma, Joan McAlpine, Aileen McLeod before that, we all have worked really hard with colleagues from other parties to get South of Scotland Enterprise up and running. And it's not just there for window dressing. It is there because it's going to have locally based decision making. It's going to have the ability to vary from the kind of economic products that Scottish Enterprise had available for the rest of Scotland previously. And a very significant factor, I think, is, and Emma was touching this earlier, the type of business base we have in our region is not, it doesn't have a huge number of large employers that are investing lots in innovation or research and development. It is dominated by small and medium sized and often family owned businesses. and we've got to take them to the next level. So it's the old Einstein's definition of insanity, isn't it? You've got a region like the south of Scotland, which has lower gross value added or lower productivity per head than any other region of Scotland at this moment in time, then it's a definition of insanity to keep doing the same thing and expect different results. So I'm really delighted that we've now got the new agency up and running. It's got excellent people running it. Martin, an excellent addition to that team, hugely respected in SEPA when he was there, and I was Environment Minister working with him at the time. He was a hugely respected official, and I have no doubt that he will give a real boost to the efforts of the south of Scotland to build on the strengths it has, but also attract new investment in energy, working with key employers like guys like Jeremy Sainsbury from Natural Power, which is a Dumfries and Galloway-based renewables company.
That's great. Thank you, Paul. Emma, Paul makes a point about the average size or the absence of larger employers, larger than almost what you might call industrial employers in the south of Scotland. And I'm reminded immediately, of course, of the enthusiasm that certain Tory politicians had, for example, moving fish processing out of Annan and moving it to England. So putting that to one side, what appetite have you seen, Emma, in South Scotland for green enterprises? I'm asking this because, as well as being the Energy Transition Director, Dr. Valenti has been appointed Green Enterprise Director by South of Scotland Enterprise.
Mm-hmm. There is an appetite, definitely. Dumfries and Galloway Council have a climate champion. So and the goals and the aspirations in many of the conversations I have, especially with our local climate champion, Dougie Campbell, are about like how do we go out and engage with different people so that we hear what ideas and innovations that they are coming up with. I know the South Scotland Enterprise, Russell Griggs, has been working with dairy farmers, for instance, looking at best ways of managing their emissions so that the dairy farm emission reductions can be continue to be worked towards. Southwest Scotland has 48% of Scotland's dairy farms, and so there needs to be obviously work done with the National Farmers Union and with all agencies to collaborate and work together to look at the best way forward. I mean, Paul talks about how people feel forgotten in the south in our area, and that's something like for the last 5 years I have been working so hard to change that perception, because I want to make sure everybody doesn't feel forgotten and continue. I use the language of shining a light on our region. I think we are at the right time to start an agency to look at green recovery, to be maybe we should be the green belt when it comes to South Scotland enterprise as far as looking at the energy transition. We do have such wonderful ways of tackling climate emergency and natural power. Jeremy Sainsbury and his team, these guys they're brimming with ideas, so we need to take those ideas forward, and I think Martin will be able to help do that.
Thanks, Emma. Paul, one other question for you. Given your background in renewables policy in particular, I'm intrigued, and it certainly strikes me the points that you're both making with regard to the economic wealth which the south of Scotland, or the economic potential that the south of Scotland has in terms of renewables and energy generation. So, Paul, where do you think that we should be heading in terms of priorities for the south of Scotland in the context of renewables and green energy generation?
It's a good point. There are a number of opportunities, I think, to do something that maybe the south of Scotland missed out on, the wealth that was generated by the oil boom during the 70s, 80s, 90s. I firmly believe you can hear me okay, I've got a bit of feedback. But I firmly believe that hydrogen will be a very significant part of our economy going forward. There's potential by the 2040s to, if we get this right, and to see Scotland become an exporter of hydrogen, predominantly to countries like Germany, Netherlands and Belgium, but others as well, that we could generate up to 300,000 jobs in the Scottish economy from that, which is about 3 times the size of our oil and gas industry today. And because of its strength in renewable electricity generation and with potential for further offshore wind development, potentially in the Solway, although that's a controversial choice, or further offshore off the coast of the Scottish borders. We have the opportunity to develop a large quantity of green hydrogen for domestic use, for decarbonising our heavier vehicles, for potential use in our heating systems, and for use in areas like rail decarbonisation, aviation potentially as well. So the South could exploit that. But the other secondary benefit, I think, of having an area that's as energy rich as the south of Scotland is that we're going to see increasingly consumers and businesses become much more sensitized as to where they get their energy from and where their products are coming from in terms of not just their provenance in terms of the type of farming perhaps that's been used for producing for food and drink, but also potentially the CO2 credentials of that farming. And I think the south of Scotland, which is heavily dependent on agri-food, has potential to, as an employer, I mean, heavily dependent on that, has a potential to be one of the lowest carbon producers of both meat and fruit and vegetables anywhere in the world if we use that energy creatively and credibly. So I think the fact that we've got Martin and the South of Scotland focusing on that, South of Scotland Enterprise Agency focusing on that, is really good news because hopefully they'll be ahead of the game rather than trailing in the wake of other regions, which has happened previously.
Thanks, Paul. We've got one more story. We've got a little bit of time, so we'll touch on a broader UK politics issue, but in particular the way in which it impacts on Scotland and on the south of Scotland. As the summer approaches and the leisure and nighttime sectors in Scotland begin to reopen, residency and workers' rights have come back to the fore. Rights that were conferred by EU membership have now been traded for a conditional status achieved by navigation of a bureaucratic labyrinth, the Home Office's EU settlement scheme. At least 5.4 million people have applied under the settlement scheme. Not all of them will be valid candidates, but that volume suggests that previous counts, which put the number of EU nationals in the UK at about 3.6 million, was short. The deadline for applications, when the grace period expires on 30th of June this year, means that the current backlog of unprocessed cases is about 320,000 people. We have already seen leaders in the nighttime and leisure sectors expressing their concern about recruitment, curiously in England and Wales, but more acutely here in Scotland, where those sectors heavily depended on short-term and seasonal workers coming from across Europe. And so, Paul, first of all, what do you think we need to do in Scotland to address the influence of the Home Office in its implementation of immigration policy in a way which is having a negative impact on Scottish businesses and Scottish communities?
Well, I mean, it's striking actually. If you look at other countries around the world, places like Switzerland, for example, I think there's a huge number of different sort of cantons within Switzerland that have their own immigration policy. So this kind of centralised, one-size-fits-all immigration policy UK government insists on having is not the only way to do this. And countries like Canada, Australia also have differential immigration policies that suit the needs of different provinces or states within those countries. And Scotland, I think, has every right to expect that a government that proclaims that it's created the most powerful devolved parliaments in the world, and that's a nonsense, of course, as I've just sort of alluded to, actually should step up and recognise that cross-party support for devolving immigration policy to Scotland should be pursued so that we can have a more realistic position. It takes account needs like hospitality, tourism, the agriculture sector in terms of the need for people in the soft fruit industry, for example, in places like Angus. It's known to be a real problem. And it does stick in the craw, though, to hear people like the owner of Witherspoons, a prominent Brexiteer now, crying crocodile tears because he can't get enough bar staff from the EU when he advocated shutting down the freedom of movement across the EU. So I think I don't have any sympathy for him at all, as it happens. But I do have sympathy for other employers who've been caught in the middle here, who weren't supporting Brexit and have found themselves in a very difficult situation. And Scotland is a welcoming country. We've always welcomed migrants to this country. and we have a more progressive approach. That is recognised in Europe. Until we have some control of our immigration policy, we're stuck with the hopeless and helpless situation that we've now got.
Thanks, Paul. And Emma, the same question for you. What do we need to do in Scotland to address the way in which the Home Office is implementing immigration policy and is thereby damaging and having a negative impact on Scottish businesses and on Scottish communities?
It is hopeless and helpless, as Paul describes the immigration policy that has been created. I have constituents that are contacting me, and even though immigration is reserved, I've had them contact their MP, who happens to be the Secretary of State, Alistair Jack, and they've had no response or very little engagement. And it's it's probably a good job that I have a good relationship with the Home Office, because our local people that are needing to be working here, that we want them to work here, their kids are in our primary schools, and they're working in our care sector. And it affects our total local communities in every way. So I would absolutely support having immigration devolved to Scotland, but at least having some bespoke approaches that work for us. Because, as Paul described, fruit picking is seasonal, but dairy workforce isn't. And that's rarely mentioned when you look at any of the information coming out of the UK government as far as like our dairy industry. You can't switch milk on and off coming out of cows. You need people to be in the workforce, and many of the workforce in our dairy sector are from European countries, and it's a real struggle to make sure that we get them their settled status, which we didn't ask for, but we need to make sure that we can engage with everybody so that they know that they're welcome here, and we want to support them to remain here as much as possible. So the bottom line is we really need to have a system that works specifically for Scotland in our various sectors. The NHS is a big one as well, and it's not just our hospitality. We need to make sure that we welcome our nurses and doctors and healthcare workers that come from other countries as well.
Thanks, Emma. Perhaps the Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Jack, is watching today and will be listening and learning from the full Scottish and taking on board the comments that you make. Or maybe not. Nevertheless, that is the full Scottish. Today, Sunday the 6th of June. Thank you to Emma and to Paul for taking the time to join us and for sharing their thoughts and insight with us. We're extremely grateful to both of you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure being here.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, then please help us by subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. But in particular, we would like you to consider subscribing or donating in order to continue to support our work. We will be here again at 7 p.m. on Monday with Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us then. In the meantime, thank you everyone for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this afternoon. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your weekend.